and great to see you all this evening. I want to start by thanking Lighthouse for hosting us. I always think the colours in this place are like the full breadth and spectrum of the left on display, and it's just such a good place to be having an event like this. It's part of the spirit of the left that I feel is perhaps reflected in the front cover of the latest issue of the Scottish Left Review, the wonderful artwork by Kat Goss, kind of conjuring of different lefts, if you like, in Edinburgh. And the that principle, I suppose, is behind this magazine and also this event. I often think, well, I'm not an artist, but if I was, I imagine that you're working at something up close and you maybe need to take a step back from time to time to get the bigger picture. And actually, I was down in England chairing a panel last week, priorities of the Scottish left at the World Transformed. And one clear priority did surface actually, and that was to make sure that we were always doing more and more to bring all the different parts of the left together, and to make sure that we are discussing and exploring all the different perspectives in a way that doesn't assume that we're all on the same page, but works towards a kind of unity that makes sense, that doesn't hide the tensions, but also that does celebrate the differences and make sure that we're all involved in these conversations that we mustn't ever take for granted. And indeed, that is the spirit in which 25 years ago, Jimmy Reid, the organiser of the Upper Clyde Shipyard, one-time Scottish National Party member, one-time Communist Party member, founded the Scottish Left Review, and in his first editorial put it in the words of sectarianism will be frowned upon, to put it as delicately as I can, he said, and that he envisioned a forum for discussion where all voices of the left were present. And where else would you get in the one magazine perspectives from, well, revolutionary socialists, Republican socialists, Greens, communists, to name a few, commenting on these big questions of the time, and I suppose the most pertinent one that is all in our minds, that question of a potential new party for the left. That new party, some would say, was initiated as a debate in Scotland even before it was in England, with the left alternative position that was put out in the Scottish Left Review. But of course, the one that most people will have in mind is the Corbyn Initiative and the Sultana Initiative that we're hearing a lot about at the moment. And I suppose it's about making sure that we have space for discussions about what that means in Scotland and what it means for Scotland, a country that's obviously always had its own political tradition and its own political agenda. So is it something that's galvanising the left, or is it a diversion? Is it something where we can kind of work through those national questions? Or is it prone to be something that will kind of immerse us into discussions that may or may not speak to the issues that we have in Scotland too? And to that end, we're going to open up, hopefully, an interesting debate, not just with contributions from the people up here, but from everybody over the next hour or so. Before we do that, though, I do want to say that the Scottish Left Review wants to have more and more of these events in its 25th anniversary year, and to make that possible, we need as much support as we can get. And to some extent that means subscribers, and if you feel like donating, whatever form the cash comes in, it means that we can do things like this. So yeah, having dealt with the material base, the structure of this event will be a few minutes contributions from the panelists that you see and who I'll introduce in a moment, and then a conversation, and then to reflect the fact that in every issue we also have bits of history, we have bits of poetry, we have bits of art, we'll have some contributions towards the end in a slightly different theme, which hopefully will take us out in a spirit of inspiration, and also bearing in mind what's happening in Palestine at the moment. So that's, I think, all that I wanted to say before I introduce the panel. So I don't think say who I was. Did I? Maybe I did. But I'm Callan Gallagher. I edit the Scottish Left Review and have done for a few years. I've been involved in various trade union activities of one form or another as well. I'm joined by, and if I can try and get a paper, a fantastic group of comrades, starting from your right, my far left. I'll leave you to judge that later. We have Pina and Jan in RS21, Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century, an eco-socialist, feminist, anti-racist and anti-imperialist organisation based in Scotland, Wales and England, who have a contribution in the latest issue. I'm just going to introduce everyone because it will help the flow later. Next to them is Conor Beaton from the Republican Socialist Platform, founded in 2020 to fight for a more democratic culture in the pro-independence left and a Republican socialist politics. And the Republican Socialist Platform also published the online magazine Heckle. And then next to me is Dan Hutchison, a Green Party councillor in Govan, and a long-time campaigner and representative in both trade union and student politics, and recently co-convener of the Scottish Young Greens as well, I believe. Wasn't recently, but joining us here from Glasgow. And then on my right is Colm McHale, editor of Scotia, which is an online broadcast platform which supports and ensures that voices on the left are getting out as far and wide as possible. Carl also is involved with Progressive International and a board member of the Scottish Left Review. So great to see you all, and great to see you all. And without anything more from me, I'm just going to hand over to our panelists to offer some reflections on where we are at the moment with the Left Party debate and where things stand. Over to you, Una and Dan.
Hello. We're just going to say a little bit about, just kind of on top of this piece in the Scottish Left Review. Thanks for the introduction, Colin, and inviting us to be on the panel with the comrades. So I think we have been feeling that the tension with this new party stuff, like the conversations tend to come around between like the electoral side of it versus the grassroots side of it, from above and below. And while these things kind of always work together and in opposition and there's pushes and pulls, and it's not one or the other necessarily, there are kind of priorities that will kind of shape the possibilities for this. So I guess we have kind of been perspective that Conor wrote in the Republican Socialist Platform piece, that like to contest the elections in 2026 could be putting the cart before the horse for what could be quite a rushed, botched job. Comrades who've been part of electoral projects in the past know like how much sheer energy it takes at the expense of other essential organising work. As the RSP wrote as well, the new party, whatever happens, will have to patiently build roots in working class communities. And when you gamble enthusiasm on a make or break election, if you lose, you have nothing to show for it. If you're in a kind of crisis, which we are in, and you choose to go to a casino, it's quite destructive behaviour rather than constructive. So people, I don't know, to just throw in a metaphor. The question would be like, how would you respond constructively to the objective crisis of disorganisation and the subjective crisis of like total working class despair that's everywhere? Can we use this new party to allow people in despair to come together and remember that we have agency in our collectivity. To go straight for a manifesto and ask working class people to vote for you doesn't build collective agency in the way that the Reform Party is trying to build collective agency. They're doing demos, organising, having socials, building tenant associations, giving out nappies on working class estates. Like, they're organising in a way that like makes kind of sense for anyone to kind of build an organisation of any tendency. So I guess what could we do with the New Left Party other than skipping straight to the ballot box and skipping straight to elections? And yeah, John's gonna say some thoughts about what's going on.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, I guess we sort of broadly take the view in House 21 that things are sort of developing a bit back to front, and I mean, it's dialectical. You need like leadership. You also need like base organising, and I suppose that's kind of where we think where our thoughts are about what's missing at the moment. Is there's a lot of watching the leaders, waiting for things to happen, and not a lot of placing initiative in other people's hands. But there's not a lot of like, I mean, it's ironic as a speaker. I'm really looking forward to a lot more like Q&A and sort of collective discussion around this, the kind that we've been trying to encourage in Your Party Glasgow through like collective assemblies. We think that might be a model that could be used as part of the dialectic of building a mass party. So a new tendency is launching. Has launched TWT, the World Transformed. Are people familiar with the World Transformed? So it's like a kind of sort of like a national political festival that's happened since the initial Corbyn years, and took a beat last year and came back together over the weekend. We were both there. I'm really knackered. It was like 4 days of like intense, everyone going, what do we do? But in the mix there was a series of different like factions and caucuses and different perspectives on what could a new party kind of look like and how could it work. And I was and RS21 was part of the launch of the Organising for Popular Power tendency, which brought together workplace organisers, tenant union organisers, anti-imperialists who work in the Palestine Solidarity movement and other kind of groups. And they launched a massive dossier of like what could we be doing at a branch level, all of us actually, like to actually build the party and build the culture and build the practice that we want. That wouldn't be a gamble, but would potentially lead to kind of the mass power that we could use to kind of contest an election or any election. And I guess the categories, to be really kind of brief about it, would look at branches as places to kind of bring lots of folk together from across the movement and map out what we were already doing rather than assuming that we're making something brand new. It could involve new forms of worker solidarity, where at the moment worker solidarity is kind of ad hoc, pretty sparse. The trade union movement is really weak and small. Most workers are not in trade unions. Most workers are not even organising with each other on the basis of kind of contestational politics. The tendency things that we could be organising in the level of communities. So at the moment, tenant unions are really leading the way in terms of like member defence, and that is something that could be broadened out as part of a mass party to look at community clinics, community defence projects where we like collectivise our problems and our other kind of shared demands. It's also like looking at different ways of developing grievance gathering. So what would it look like for a mass party, but instead of like selling votes and selling the party, actually goes out and listens and sort of collects what are people's shared concerns and builds a manifesto and finds candidates from that way, front to back rather than back to front. And several other things as well in terms of mass political education work that stems from what our experience is rather than leads from theory. If you're interested, it'd be really great to see people involved in organising that party through tending in that direction, and we could spend 8 months doing that or the other one.
Great, thanks both. And one thing I want to make sure is that the conversation is clear and comprehensible to everyone. And so I just, at this point, if anybody has any questions about clarifying or wanting to know something in particular about what you heard there, I'm not meaning to kind of take a political perspective, but is there anything people are just wondering about on the basis of that presentation before we move on to the next speaker? Great. Well, then over to you then, Connor.
Thanks very much. And is this working? Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much to Caelan and the Scottish Left Review for the opportunity to contribute on behalf of the Republican Socialist Platform. The contribution that we have in the latest edition of the magazine, it's got my name on it, but it was a collective effort. It changed quite a lot in the process of putting it together. Actually, there are certain things that I was talked out of putting in there that I wish I had, because I think they would have been borne out in the last, in recent weeks. And I think, when I think about when we started the process of writing that, compared to now, I remember when that was, Caelan, when was it that we invited contributions? 2 months ago. In some respects, a lot has happened, but really not much has happened, and we're still, we've got the same kind of questions and uncertainty. If anything, maybe we have a little bit more uncertainty. But from our perspective, as an organisation that came out of the independence movement and was formed at a point during lockdown when there was a lot of interest in independence, and we tried to develop ways of coming up against the UK state's intransigence in refusing a referendum. The main thing that we've tried to challenge is the idea that a new political party of the left can be founded on basically an all UK or all Britain basis. And that's not just because, as we point out in the article, that there's a long-standing tradition of socialists organising independently here in Scotland. That's because we actually have a different political landscape, and that requires us to have a different political strategy, and to try and understand why these things are different and what would work here. And our feeling is that right now there have not really been enough opportunities to have a discussion about your party in a Scottish context. What we know is that in the run-up to this founding conference in November, there's going to be regional assemblies, but we're talking about assemblies that might take place, for example, in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and in Dundee, rather than something that brings together people in Scotland to talk about the issues that actually affect us on a national level. And so that's another reason I'm thankful actually for the Scottish Left Review to play its part in creating that space. There have been suggestions, and I mean, I think we've all seen the emails in the mailing list where there's reference to Scotland will have this opportunity to decide its relationship to this new party. But what's not very clear is actually how that will happen, how that will be decided. And so far, we've not actually had an opportunity to input into that. And the way in which this becomes the most pressing question is when it comes to the Holyrood election that's coming up in May. And as Una said, and thank you for quoting from her contribution, by the way, it's very hard for me to see how you can mount a serious national election campaign in such a short period of time before you even started to work through what we think about the big political issues in Scotland, including independence. And in many ways, I feel like this has been an afterthought to the process of establishing the party, that if people had appreciated the significance of the Scottish parliamentary elections, that maybe this process could have started a lot earlier. Whereas we seem to be working to a timetable informed by the English local elections, which, although they're significant, and we all hope that might spell the end of Keir Starmer's political career, we don't know they're of a lesser significance, and also have the benefit of pre-existing groups and pre-existing elected councillors, whereas we're starting very much from scratch here. The reason that we think that your party can't avoid taking a position on independence is partly because it is a big political issue and because you can't really credibly avoid talking about it. It's also because the UK is a profoundly undemocratic state, and actually the direction of travel is towards it becoming worse. So Keir Starmer is leading us in an even more authoritarian direction. There's new clampdowns on the right to protest, particularly down south. And the looming threat on the horizon is a reform government that comes in that is prepared to basically bulldoze through every convention that's protecting what is left of British democracy and fully imposing a right-wing view, using what's happening in the US under Trump effectively as a playbook for, maintaining total control. And I don't think they would be willing to let that be challenged anyway, including from the Scottish Parliament. So we view the breakup of the UK state as actually a strategic necessity for the left. And what I think is a situation we want to avoid is where only the SNP and the Greens, who have failed in many ways over the last few years, are the only ones that are actually making that argument. So we feel very much that your party needs to facilitate a discussion, and this question of running in an election in May we shouldn't even be talking about that until we've had that discussion and we're able to decide what our strategy is, because the best thing that your party can be is something that brings together quite disparate movements that have been fighting on all different fronts and develops a strategy that brings all of them together. And very much what I hope is the people who are in charge, who are currently leading this process, can take heed of the fact that we need this to be facilitated in Scotland. And if it's not going to be formally facilitated, then it's going to rely very much on forums like this to play that role.
Thank you, Conor. Again, any questions or anything you're thinking, that sounds interesting, but I didn't quite follow, or anything about what Conor said in terms of clarity you would like. Just a quick straw poll, and obviously no pressure to do so, but how many people didn't join your party but signed up in that initial round of, put your name and email in, and if you want to be part of this project? I'm just wondering if we can get a fair sense of how many people have been getting those emails. Okay, so we're kind of about half and half in terms of who's been up to speed with that, which again we can come back to. But over to you, Dan.
Thanks. Thanks, Bria, for having me as well. Callan sent us an email on Friday asking us to have a think about kind of what our hope is and how we can feel about the party. And I was up in Inverness enjoying time, not in Glasgow for once, although no one's left for people in Glasgow, but I was enjoying the city. I live in Glasgow. And I spent the whole weekend trying to think about how I would answer that question. And I started by thinking, actually, it feels pretty exciting. And I know I say that as a member of a competitive party and all that stuff. And I think what I said in my piece about Holyrood being kind of void of a socialist party since the SSP exited, I think that is the thing that I think is quite exciting. We have socialists that are represented in political chambers across Scotland that are members of the SNP, Greens and Labour, and I think there's a fight constantly for those people to try and get what we see as progressive and socialist change on the agenda. Too often we have to make concessions, bite our tongues we don't want to, just to try and get something moving. Then as kind of Saturday rolled around, I think I moved into a little bit of a fear. I remembered back to what happened a couple of weeks ago and thought, maybe this just isn't going to happen. Are they going to fall out again? How's that going to go? And I think the fear I have is that, and exactly what Conor said, we're looking at an Nigel Farage-led government in 2029, and frankly that is horrifying. We've already seen how it's the tail wagging the dog with the Labour government. It's led to race riots. I've got community organisations in my ward that have moved away from doing the plethora of things that they're doing because they can only really focus on anti-racism at the moment. And they've only got 5 MPs. Like, if we have 250, 300, like, what on earth are they going to do? Like, what are migrants and people of colour, queer people, disabled people, what are they going to do when they control the reins of power? I've spoken to loads of people the last couple of weeks about kind of that fear that people are starting to get into about it. I've got friends that are planning where they're going to run away to. Like, why on earth are we at that? Why are we accepting that? And I think that's where it kind of moves a bit away from that onto relief. The SNP, Labour and the Tories, they don't cut the mustard when it comes to breaking reform up. Kind of what governments in RS21 say, there needs to be some level of mass membership left party. Where I have settled on is I think I have a bit of relief. Even if people stumble, they falter, I think everyone involved in the new party understand the stakes of it. They understand that we're kind of staring right down the barrel of that far right government. And I know reform isn't the only thing that is the purpose of the party. The UK's been rapidly declining since the 80s. Our institutions need kind of politicians that are willing to fund things, willing to rebuild things, which we just don't really have just now. and our communities are desperately needing that real redistribution of wealth. That only a real left party that is solely focused on doing those kind of things. Yeah, I mean, Glasgow City Council and all local authorities across the country can't fill potholes. We can't pay our social care and cleansing workers enough. We can't provide housing to homeless people, and we can't even run community centres. Like, what kind of country is that? And that's all caused by half a century of government austerity from London, now from Edinburgh. And for me, that's kind of where the feeling of relief comes from. It feels like there's a gear change in how the UK operates. We are accepting that the left might unite in some way, shape or form, rather than just having a couple of politicians that shout from the sidelines of their party to try and shift the narrative. I'm conscious I haven't yet mentioned the Greens before Callan waves the 1 minute thing at me. So yeah, maybe I should do that. Yeah, I'll be candidly honest. I'm pretty disappointed the way that our party leadership have responded to the formation of the new party. I think in England and Wales, the new leader, Zach Blansky, whether you like him or not, has been a bit more collaborative. He's understood that the left can't cannibalise in constituencies, but the Scottish Greens have kind of ignored it as much as they can. I think our members and our activists haven't, but I think our leadership certainly have. I mean, we're now banned from speaking to the kind of proto branches. I know in Glasgow the comrades have done exceptional work. I have explicitly been told I'm not allowed to speak to them about it, which I just think is quite frustrating. I think the Greens are very, very good at talking the talk. I think our policy platform paper should be really strongly aligned to where I expect the new party will get to at some point, but we do often fail to walk the walk. Scottish Greens conference is this weekend, which I'm utterly excited about. And we do have a debate about initiating talks with the new party. But the mood music on that is that we won't be starting those talks. I think that, frankly, shooting ourselves in the foot. Electorally, I think it risks the significance of saving the environment in any future government policy. And I think it also, and more crucially, we will be looking at a mass exodus of our socialist membership. There is many of us that are really keen to see a relationship develop, be that in electoral alliances or pacts. We don't know, those conversations haven't happened. Frankly, my preference, I think, would be to allow dual membership parties, but I'm very confident that that won't be a popular opinion within the Greens. But yeah, this weekend we'll see, so maybe you'll see some press.
Thanks, Dan, and for the a really candid and really clear position there. I think that before we move to the last speaker, also an invitation for you to start thinking about any kind of questions or any things that have become really clear to you over the last kind of wee while, because I think that that's the kind of starting point, and an honest discussion is really valuable and exciting. But before that, over to you, Cole.
Thanks very much, Callan. I think the first thing to say is how important panels like these are to facilitate the conversation that we desperately need to happen, as Connor outlined. The second thing to say is that very clearly on both the left and the right in this country, as across Europe, we are witnessing a period of decomposition of the organisational and party political forms that we got used to over the course of the last century and the first 25 years of this one. On the right, as we've said, it manifests in reform. On the left, it is slightly more complicated, a huge uptick in membership of the Greens in the last few days, 30,000 new members, I think, since Zach Blansky was elected at a England and Wales level, and 800,000 sign-ups for your party in the initial email call-out. I think what's important, and what I'm going to try and make my 5 minutes about, is thinking about this in a distinctly Scottish context, because that period of decomposition is different up here. And it's different because of the national question, and because, as Connor said, we have our own distinct, devolved context. John Swinney is about to lead the SNP into a third decade in government. Now, a man as uninspiring, intellectually bereft and head teacher-esque as John Swinney being about to do that and achieve such political success says something about quite how distinct our political context is, and that's why we have to think about Scotland in a different way. Your party, since its spontaneous eruption in July, hasn't facilitated that conversation. That conversation hasn't happened in Scotland. Callan said it almost began earlier in Scotland. I don't think that's right. I think it began 6 years ago in England following the collapse of Corbynism, and it really only began in earnest in Scotland a few months ago. And your party emerges from contradictions that are most prevalent and at their most pronounced south of the border rather than up here. Yes, there is a generalised crisis of capitalism. Yes, there are huge challenges facing workers and people across Scotland with regards to paying their bills. But if you take the principal confrontation through which your party emerges, which is Palestine, the contexts are distinctly different. So if you think about the things that the English left has been able to achieve on the question of Palestine, you see the election of 4 independent MPs in the July 2024 general election. You see a mass movement that can mobilise 1 million people on the streets of London, and you see dozens, if not hundreds, of councillors leave the Labour Party during the genocide, looking towards joining a new political party. Now that's a basis which, to be blunt, we don't have in Scotland, because the contradiction on Palestine isn't as sharp. The Scottish Government have mediated that question. They have been able to act as a buffer between the British state and the movement quite successfully, and obviously there have been atrocious actions, including meeting with the deputy Israeli ambassador, but I think we have to be honest about the fact that that contradiction just isn't as sharp, and there are other examples, and that does pose different questions for us about the base that we want to draw if we're trying to build a mass working class political party in Scotland. So it's not emerged from Scotland, but rather washed up on our shores, if you like. And I think that on these shores, the politics is slightly weaker. I think we have to be honest about the fact that our national political conversation over the last 5 years has not been about generally the politics that we would like it to be about. I mean, for goodness sake, the Scottish Parliament has been talking about seagulls for upwards of 3 weeks now. Seagulls have claimed a Scottish Government minister's position and £100,000 worth of Scottish Government public money in the form of a seagull summit. Any legacy of the referendum uptick, the organised mass political activity that we saw in the period that followed, has been blunted and demobilised by the Scottish political class, and that's the context in which we are operating. I think that had a mass political party emerged down south that was able to translate that 800,000 figure into 100,000 members, say, for example, into something that was going to end up with more members than the Greens under Zach Polansky, then there was a hope that it could have achieved some success in Scotland by virtue of that tagging on the coattails, if you like, of what was going on in England. But I think the developments over the last 2 weeks, the catastrophe, if you like, with regards to Jeremy and Zara's relationship, has probably prevented that from happening. And then I've got a minute left, but there is a more fundamental question here, and that's about whether we are ready for a mass political party of the working class in this country. That's whether we've learnt the lessons of the last 10 years, and with my 45 seconds approximately, I'm going to ask some of the questions that I hope we'll have in the Q&A. Politically, have we addressed the contradictions that were self-evident in Corbynism? Have we addressed the contradictions between the post-industrial north of England and the metropolitan cities? Have we built a political culture in which we're comfortable disagreeing with one another? I would suggest that Zara Sultana is saying that she's not comfortable to be in a party with social conservatives precludes the prospect of building a mass working class party. I think these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves very fundamentally, and these are the questions that anyone engaged in the task of party formation in Scotland should be asking. Have we fundamentally developed a politics in Scotland that speaks to Scottish issues that affect working class people here over the last 5 years that any party could then begin to platform? I think these are the questions we need to ask, and they're the questions we need to ask because we need a party. I thoroughly want your party to succeed. I think it's critical that it does. I think there is an urgent need for an alternative left pole in this country, an urgent need to build mass working class organisation, and I really hope that your party becomes the vehicle through which we do that, but I think it only becomes that vehicle in the event that it is able to answer some of the questions that we have comprehensively failed on in the last 10 years. And unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, those signs aren't there.
Thanks very much, and for the that kind of pivot towards asking questions that I think is going to be vital for any of this movement building, and making sure that those questions are informed by what's happening south of the border, but are real to the situation in Scotland, not as it was, a little more than 10 years ago when there was a kind of energy that is not on the scene at the moment, but real to Scotland as we know it and as we live in it. So I think that might be another way to move forward here in terms of asking questions. Are there any questions, not so much for asking the panel, but for asking the room? And let's just see if we can gather some of the kind of questions or the kind of contradictions, if we want to put it on those terms, or the kind of impasses, or the kind of, let's start with a little bit of the pessimism, shall we? And then we can work our way towards something a little bit more clear about where we go from here and what work is to be done, and where we're going to go forward as a movement, as a left. But is there anything kind of itching for you in terms of what you've heard, or what you're seeing, or where things are at the moment? Yeah, I can see a hand here. Yeah. I think what I'll do is I'll just paraphrase back, because otherwise it's...
I can come.
Well, you can come. Yeah, you can come.
Oh, yeah, no, just where the people online, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm Green. I'm actually a candidate for the Hollywood elections happening in 2026. I'm also part of the organising committee behind the Women Against the Far Right in Scotland, which is also attempting to kind of bring sort of broad left groups together. My question is, I'm excited about your party. I think there's lots of room on the left for more parties. I don't think we should be restricted to one big leftist party. Multiple is great. I'd be excited to work with your party in Parliament should they be elected. How do we make sure, if we're doing this kind of broad leftist coalition that's focusing on class politics, that trans rights are front and centre, that anti-misogyny is front and centre, and that anti-racism is front and centre of that? And I'm personally feeling like we're already beginning to brush that under the carpet a little bit, and we're having Sultana say, look, I'm being treated badly as a woman of colour. Like, so how do we deal with that as a left? I think we're bad at it.
Thank you, Kate. And yeah, we'll certainly come to that. And I think that's yeah. Is there anything else that, let's gather some other thoughts if we might, and rather than a kind of ping pong in terms of question and answer, but is there anything else that feels like it really needs to be out there and present? Yeah, feel free to say it there, and I can feed it back, or come up if you like, whatever works for you.
So regarding independence, I'm
Yeah.
speaking about independence obviously as a Portuguese person, so take it with a grain of salt. But I guess my question is, what happens, because as I see it, support for independence is roughly half and half at all times. And unfortunately, I'd like an independent Scotland. But what happens if the Your Party members decide that is not for independence? And what does that mean for a left-wing party that doesn't stand for an independent country, or for the people to decide that they want to be independent? Like that.
Okay, yeah, so the question being around independence, and obviously the fact that about 50% of Scots want independence, or people who are living in Scotland want independence, and what's happening there with respect to your party, and what would happen should your party decide that it's not in favour of independence? How is that going to be a road forward? Another really core question, I think. Yeah, anything else? And if you have answers to these questions, obviously we'll hear the answers too, but is there maybe one or two more that we can kind of bring into the mix? Yeah, so I'm now seeing three, which is grand. So let's see, let's start here and then here and then here. Yeah.
Apologies, you kind of already asked this in Manchester, but I'm kind of curious how wedded we as the Scottish left are to party politics in general. I feel like I'm hearing a lot from loads of different places, including people on this panel, that like there's kind of base building. We all like even people who are very involved in your party and the politicking around that agree. Well, we don't want a solely electoral vehicle. So then, does that mean your party has a branch who distributes school food, or is it like a kind of more movementist approach where it's like there's a left mutual aid thing going on? Because there is, like I'm part of a left kind of progressive mutual aid thing that's just getting going in Edinburgh. And it's more coming out of the climate movement or even the kind of hippie scene, Salisbury Centre. So yeah, I'm just curious, like how party political do we want to think as?
Great. So the question around how wedded the left is to party politics and what's the relationship between that and what might be called base building, and I suppose the different things that the left does that don't naturally, maybe obviously take a party form, distributing food, mutual aid, are those things that we envision your party undertaking? Are they a separate bit of work? And where does that overlap with others in the city or in our society who are undertaking that work as well? Yeah, great. A question here? Yeah. So as a group, how do, I mean, as a group here, I guess the question might go broader to all different groups. How do we coalesce with each other? Or is it a bit like Monty Python? And in terms of what the, how to reach a compromise and figure out what the priorities are, and then work from there. Because there's a concern that your party is maybe being seen as what's already there. Rather than working forward. Great. And another really critical question, I think. And we'll take one more, and then I'll quickly recap, because I think it's quite interesting to see all these in the round. But yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Lee. So my question is, are there any discussion about more, like anarchists? Like, you mentioned like your party is Scottish version. Are there any discussion about like different like Scottish version leftist party? And also you also talked about like go to more like engage with working class people. I wonder what strategies have you folks thought about? And one thing about nowadays people like in working class neighborhood, I'm from Western Coast, so I feel like it's quite parliamentary management or the parties are so distant and people are totally disillusioned. And are there any discussion about direct democracy rather than just representative? We have some MSPs, so we have councillors that speak for us, but rather than we don't know what's exactly happening. And this kind of so-called like participatory, like try to engage with citizens, even though I'm quite critical about citizenship, who can be citizens. Yeah, so just wonder like whether we can kind of learn from your party the kind of assemblies, try to engage people with a long-term participatory. People gather together to discuss issues that concern them. Yeah, just wonder. Thank you.
Great, yeah, a really rich question, I think. I mean, I think where you started was, I think, a question about anarchism and how that might relate to the developments and movement. But also linking that to the question of involvement of working class and what strategies there might be for that. which raises a question as to whether a parliamentary or a party-based approach is as good as something that is a little bit more participatory and that is potentially sort of building in principles of assemblies and other forms of more direct democracy. So that, I think another really critical question, and let me just then recap. And what I'm going to do is, obviously we won't be able to kind of give our thoughts on each of these, but first of all, a quick thought in response to some of that from the panel, and then any further thoughts on some of that from the floor, if that sounds all right. And yeah, so the five, Kate was asking about how do we make sure class politics is not in tension with trans rights and anti-racism. The independence question, what if your party was to end up supporting, the union? How wedded to the left is party politics? How wedded is the left to party politics rather than base building? How do we all cohere and identify compromises and priorities? And what about that question around more direct participatory democracy that perhaps is a way of building working class and power in a different way than a party system might allow? So yeah, lots of questions there. Shall we reverse order this time, Paul, or do you want to go through the same?
Okay. Interesting questions. Good discussion. Very good discussion. I think on this question of unity and building out with the party, I think it's really interesting. Building more broadly and working with the Greens and and maybe not the SSP, but other groups on the left. I think we have to be quite honest here, and that's about the sort of party we want to build. If we want to build a hegemonic force on the left that puts socialism and class politics at its fore, we have to be honest about some of the decisions which have been made by the parties in recent years who we're talking about working with, right? And that includes the Greens in Scotland, who during their time in government voted consistently to lower working class living standards. I mean, that is what happened during the Bute House Agreement. Green Party MSPs voted every year to lower the living standards of working class people in this country via cuts budgets. In addition to that, stripped power and control from working class Scots by justifying the privatisation of our natural resources during the Scotland auction by signing a £2 billion PFI deal which sold off vast swathes of our land to the billionaire class. I think that ultimately we have to be clear in our politics, and that's the priority of this party for me, of whatever comes, is to raise the level of political debate and politics in Scotland, to reassert the primacy of class politics in this country. That's what we need to do now and need to do urgently in order to combat the threat posed by the right. And that means being very clear about what we stand for. And of course there are comrades across the political spectrum who we should and will ideally look to work with. More broadly, well,
Yeah, I mean, go on, but go ahead.
you sure?
I'm just time watching you.
On the question, is it a bit like Monty Python? I actually think it's worse. I think like it like had this sketch been written, it would have been much funnier than The Life of Brian. But I think that there's also a pivot here that the reaction is often to say that we need more democracy in this founding process and that we need to open the doors, and I think that's a perfectly natural reaction, and it's one that I would be inclined to support. But it is also the case that we need to get to a point where we actually have a party, and party formation shouldn't, in my view, be done with lots of post-it notes and assemblies. I think we need an organisation, and then that creates democratic structures in which people feed into. I don't think we can slow the process down at this point. I think what needs to happen is a party needs to be set up urgently with structures that enable democratic input from grassroots members. I think that there is often an overemphasis on this sort of participatory democracy which is not to say that it's not incredibly important and has its role, but is to say that ultimately in the process of party formation you need a vanguard and you need a leadership and you need discipline within an organisation, and we haven't got a good leadership, that's undeniable, and it would be much better if we had one that we could trust. However, ultimately we haven't got a party yet, and I think that the formation of tendencies and factions can take away from and ignite a debate that cannot ultimately affect change until a party has been founded, and we're not at that point yet.
Thanks. Dan?
Thanks. Yeah, I suppose, right, I'll try to do these in some sort of sensible order. I think the question about went into party politics, I think it's not the first time I've had that conversation with people, and I think the problem is, to change it, you need to win it, and you need to break it, and then fix it. And I think people get uncomfortable with having to participate in the game, if you like, that they disagree with, but that's how you get the power to change it and fix it. There is other ways of doing it, of course. They might be more difficult, but I think for me the system is entirely broken. That needs fixed, but it's how you get to it. The question of independence, I think the reason it stayed at 50-50 is because we got very, very clear feedback, and I mean all, like, politicians, the public, everyone got very clear feedback during the independence referendum that people were uncomfortable with it because they didn't know if we were going to keep the NHS, if we were going to have pensions, the question about the currency, those were very clear, and the government, the SNP and the SNP Green government, have just not really touched them. And that's why it's still 50-50. I think that is probably the closest to participatory democracy that we've ever got, is that people knew what they thought, knew the arguments inside and out, and gave very clear feedback to those in power, and it's been just ignored for 11 years. And I think that's why we're now at the position where everyone's generally unhappy. I think I went off piece, which was silly. I think the question about Kate's question about a mass party and the kind of, I think there was a certainly in the summer there was a concern that the new party would be accepting particularly one of the MPs that had done, which I can't even remember. It was Adnan Hussain. It feels so long ago, and I'm just back from holiday, so I apologise. My brain's not started again yet. Was saying some transphobic stuff, and that wasn't good. I think this is where me and Cole disagree, and we've had this disagreement before. But I think Zara was right in saying that the new party shouldn't have a place for social conservatism. I think social conservatism tends to come from when people have no control over their own being, and I think that's where your general misogyny and transphobia and all the different things that people are being shits to other people about comes from being so poor and having no control over their life. And I think that's what the new party should be focusing on fixing. And to do that, you need to say no. Like, at some point, the party will need to say no. And I think being nice to trans people and women probably is a pretty good place to start.
Thanks. Yeah, moving straight on.
Okay, so I'm gonna follow calls, leave and take the mask off because I keep steaming up my glasses and I can't see anyone that I'm speaking to. Sorry. Yeah, I'm going to try and respond to a few of those questions. I think the one I'd like to start with, the person from Wester Hales. I'm not an anarchist, so I can't speak for anarchists. But I think there's an important question that you've touched on there about democracy, and a big part of why I would describe myself as a Republican is not because I would have a particularly strong feeling about the monarchy, but because I think it's to tap into a political tradition that is all about democracy and the fact that democracy should be extended in our lives. That, you know, we've got a very frail idea of democracy as, you know, you go to an election every 5 years and you get to vote for someone who maybe represents you on one particular issue. we want to, of course, deepen that kind of democracy and extend it into all aspects of our life, including our economic life, so our workplaces, our communities, the whole idea of what we produce. And it's something I think that is quite natural to a lot of people. A lot of people want that, even if they can't express it that way. And you see the far right tap into this when they have slogans that are about taking back control. A lot of them tap into this same kind of anxiety, this feeling of we don't really have a say in the decisions that are made, and we want to have a say somehow. And I think we're going to have to fight back against that by fighting for a democratization of society, and it starts also with democratizing our organizations, our movements, our trade unions. All of those have to make sure that they're fighting for the people that are part of it. Maybe an illustrative example. So the question about independence. So I'm from Dundee originally, and Dundee voted for independence by a pretty significant margin, biggest margin in Scotland actually. Sorry to the Glaswegians, but we had that referendum in late 2014. The next year, there was a high school in Minas Hill in Dundee, which is an area that, because we'd seen the sampling thing, we knew that this area voted 80% yes, because it was a working class area, it was a pro-independence area. The SNP ran the council as majority, and they proposed closing down Minas Hill High School, which was quite an important symbol for the local community there. And there was a really big community meeting, which I helped organise, where people came and were furious about it. And one woman stood up and said, "We didn't vote yes for the SNP to close down our school." And the argument that the council was making at the time was, we're consulting on this. But nobody felt for a second that there was a genuine process of consultation. They knew that the council had made a decision, this school should close, and everything leading up to that decision was going to be about justifying it. And that's what happened. And we have a huge cultural issue with, especially local government, being opaque and decisions being taken in people's names that people don't even know about. People don't pay attention to what's happening in local government. But why would they? Because they don't have any real influence. And that to me is a perfect illustration of, we tapped into something with the independence movement. We tapped into people wanting a sense of control over their political future, and the SNP have actually trampled on that ever since. And that's part of the task that the pro-independence left has, is to try and redevelop this idea of working class people in Scotland should be in control of their lives. One of the other things that was to be quite formative about that time is I was a member of a left-wing political party, the Scottish Socialist Party, at the time that we were running that community campaign. I was getting told by senior organisers in it to stop bothering with this because it wasn't as important as doing a city centre stall, distributing leaflets and selling newspapers. And I found that a frustrating experience, because this is actually where politics is. It's in our communities, and it's about things that matter to people, and it's about taking our cue from that and not just imposing our idea of this is what's the most important thing, this is the demand, and we need to make sure that we start telling people what they should want. So I think for me, hopefully that's answered 3 questions in one, but if we are going to make a serious break from politics in this country so far, we have to change all of these things. We have to change the way that we think about democracy and how we organise in response to that.
I think I'll follow suit with getting rid of the mask, because yeah, I really agree with a lot of what's said there, and I think these are they're quite disparate questions, right? Like they're sort of constellating like a really big, broad political puzzle. I think I would like to speak to the question, or that sort of puzzle around what does it mean to sort of relate class solidarity to oppression and to like trans people's right to exist and migrants' rights to exist and other people's rights to exist. I think that's already been addressed so far, but I feel like that might be kind of core to some of the problem that we're having at the moment as the working class, that we're accepting class divisions, which is something that like might be is exactly what the far right wants to kind of egg on. It is not interested in a class politics, it's interested in a sacrificial politics. Whereas we want to be for a politics of like maximum solidarity, where we actually sort of do build power. So for example, in April, when the Supreme Court introduced that kind of ruling around trans people's rights, that was a working class issue. Like working class people includes trans people who are now accepting new ways to be sort of beaten up by the boss and kind of gender policed and all sorts of stuff. And it's not just trans people; it's anyone whose gender can be policed, or like, are you this or are you that? Can you use this bathroom? Can you not? People are being like pushed out of work. they're being like fired, like constructively dismissed, all sorts of stuff like that. And the fact that we're not able to articulate a clear working class politics which rejects sacrificial logic to throw them under the bus because they get this, so we can't have that, is part of, I think, our problem of like working class subjectivity, that we're not prepared to sort of think about mass socialist politics, not through the lens of signifiers like gender or like race or other things, but rather through like shared like material interests like housing, food, healthcare, justice, dignity, belonging, safety. Like these are things that drive fear, and I feel like a lot of maybe we're not very. I feel like maybe we're not particularly articulate about this, but like we're in a fearful time. Like this is a fearful moment in like our political history. Like I feel a lot of fear. I imagine that people in this room probably feel a lot of fear and apprehension. I wonder if that fear sort of drives us to sort of wonder whether we need to be kind of a bit too tolerant of like folk who are kind of like living through their fear into their politics and saying, okay, we'll just like focus on a few people. I wonder if it's also kind of like justifying the fear of like what if some of the working class decides to go for for the union rather than for independence, because we're just going to have a vote without a deliberative process where we actually align on our material issues and then like think, okay, if we're going to have independence, what does that mean for us collectively? What does that materially mean? I wonder if we have a fear about like jumping the gun and starting at the vote rather than kind of actually relating. And I also wonder if that's like the fear of like the left being sort of so like decomposed in the way that the working class is decomposed. Like what do we agree on? What do we disagree on? To what degree is what we agree on enough for us to actually work on stuff together? Actually, like the factions and tendencies that have been sort of forming up around the English Fuel Party agreed a unity platform at the World Transformed Festival last weekend, because they realised that actually they agree on pretty much everything. But that was a fearful situation for everyone going in, because most people assumed that, oh Jesus, we're on a kind of Monty Python sort of timeline. We're actually not. That's the weird thing. Like there's a kind of, I'll wrap it up. I think this is a very kind of, it's important to me that we maybe recognise that we're in historically new times, and that is a scary prospect, because the prospect of mass organisation or the prospect of actually changing the timeline actually requires quite a lot of us, all of us individually and separately, to kind of like engage intellectually as the working class and really kind of think that through without kind of taking the reactive perspective that the far right would like us to, and reformists too. Yeah.
Great and interesting questions. I guess I was maybe thinking, about the direct democracy question, because it links to a few other things, and if we are to focus on direct democracy, I think it would mean like changing the image of a party that we kind of have. Like a lot of what was said is like there's a default image of a party which is like running for elections and stuff, and representative democracy and this kind of thing. But we could imagine a party for direct democracy, and that would mean kind of changing the direction of travel like straight away. And getting involved in the kind of assemblies and building relationships and spaces for decision making on local levels. And this is, happens a lot in other countries, barely happens in Britain, but it's like it is a form of organising that can work. And I suppose maybe wanted to come a little bit to Cole's point, like about about what it is to form a party, like building structures quickly that enable democratic input later is one way to look at it. But you could also see a party as just people doing stuff, and so tendencies of people doing some stuff and tendencies of other people doing other stuff, like that's what makes the party, and assemblies where people take decisions as like the Glasgow proto branch or the Govan proto branch could also be constitutive of what a grassroots rank and file party could look like. Participatory democracy doesn't have to be like opinion gathering by representatives who then meet demands. It can also be working groups that can use party funds to make change together. Rank and file networks organising for changes at work, collective self-education. I don't know, maybe just on the point about like how you would keep trans liberation and migrant justice stuff central is like supporting rank and file networks of people at work or in communities to come together with around issues they're getting around this already. Like there's been such an uptick in transphobic attacks and racially motivated attacks even in the last year, that like having people coming together to organise around that specifically, like that's something a party could support, and it would be at a grassroots level. As much as you can just say that in your policy and say that like our policy is for trans liberation, but like supporting people to come together to actually fight for it on specific levels of like this employer is doing that, can we resist that? This neighbourhood is facing that, can we bring people out to resist that? Like that's something that could be part of this as well if people get involved.
Thanks all for that. I think really diverse and colourful illustration, I suppose, of some of what the spirit of a party is and will be and can be, and potentially would be. One of the things that we are interested in at the Scottish Left Review is always exploring what the culture of the left is globally, internationally, but also what the culture of the left is in Scotland. And I was thinking about some of what your party people have articulated around the culture of a party they imagine being pints on the pavement. And the kind of, I think they have in mind that sort of English pub that is slightly different maybe than the one we have here. And at first it's like, well, that's clearly not going to wash in every part of Scotland. But I suppose it's about thinking how we generate a culture that is going to bring people in, that is going to reach to the communities and the places and the school grounds and all the kind of environments that we know class power is not what it once was. We don't have that long, but I suppose I wondered about inviting people. If you suppose there was some party going in it, suppose it was something along the lines of what was inspiring you to get involved or to be a part of it. There's an array of different things that you might do and what that might be. And we've heard that a bit, but I guess I wondered if anyone wanted to just say what would the most exciting thing that you would be doing, or what would your activity look like or feel like, and where would it be, in Edinburgh, in Wester Hailes, wherever it might be, just to get a bit of a flavour of what the imagination allows us to kind of play with. Is there anyone has any flashes of imagination they would like to share as we start to move on? If that's a too constraining question for people at this point, then we've got a few minutes for other reflections. But if we, at this point, I think, keep it in terms of how we realise some of this vision. Yeah, I can see it. Do you want here? If you want to just, I can feed it back to the group if you like.
Yeah, I can come up if that's
okay. Sure.
Thanks. My name's Ellie. I'm also a Green candidate for the elections next year. I know. I'm actually on both the question you said and actually I also very self-aware here, but also wanted to reflect a little bit on Kate's question. I'm conscious that I don't want this to be a discussion between two Green candidates about what different parties should be doing. It was on the issue of trans rights, and I say this as someone who's trans myself and who is very, very aware that the strategy we've had so far has not been working, and that trans rights are at probably the worst possible point that they've been in my lifetime. and I think a lot of that, unfortunately, and I think we have to do some self-reflection here, has been because of that sort of strategy of go away turf, which really hasn't worked. It's pushed people away and it's allowed negative feelings towards my community to fester and our rights to be taken away as a result. And I think it's where it comes down to what the left needs to do collectively, and I think that's why organising needs to be, you know, and in the sort of traditional sense of organising, needs to be such a key part of what the left, including within this new party, does. To bring people on board and to have those conversations with people, you know, in the workplace or, you know, in your neighbourhood or wherever it is, to bring people on board rather than pushing them away. And I think in the context of, for example, what, you know, is there space for social conservatives, etc., in a new party, for example? Well, the reality is that I have spent time, you know, speaking at and standing on pickets arm in arm with people who I know to be openly gender critical. I've been on, you know, marches for Palestine with people who I know probably don't necessarily support or agree with my right to exist as who I am, but the larger cause has meant that I've been okay with that in that moment, because that's not been what the topic we've been talking about has been. When it comes to if a party is voting on my rights, I expect those elected representatives to not just vote in support of my rights, but to be enthusiastically advocating for my human rights. But should that prohibit people from being part of a party because they're not quite sure yet, or because they've got questions, or because they think they've got concerns? Because let's face it, that's the media environment that we've been in. I'm not sure that it should. And just really quickly, I also just wanted to address the sort of independence thing, because I think that's also a really important conversation, because at the weekend the SNP had their conference where their members enthusiastically endorsed a strategy for independence that's not a strategy for independence, it's a strategy to get as many SNP MSPs elected as possible. And actually, I wanted to slightly disagree with Dan a little bit, which doesn't happen very often. But around sort of the Dan talked about how, you know, the governments, both the SNP government and the Butte House Agreement, SNP Green governments, you know, should have sort of addressed those issues and those concerns that people brought up after the referendum. I'm not sure that it's actually the role of the government, although I think it is absolutely the role of those parties. I think the role of the government should be to be absolutely maximising the use of its devolved powers, so that instead of it being a case of, oh, you can go further, you can do this, it's a case of, no, actually, we genuinely can't go further to improve your lives, we need independence. I think it's the role of the parties, and I think it should be the role of a new party as well, to have a cohesive vision of what an independent Scotland should look like. The SNP absolutely doesn't have one. Unfortunately, I don't think the Greens necessarily have one either, although I think slightly more than the SNP. The Greens are sort of like, it'll be a republic, which is great, and it'll be in the EU, which is a debate I'm not going to open on a Tuesday evening. But I think that the new party absolutely has to support independence and has to be actively advocating for independence, because the SNP aren't going to win us independence. So who is? And I think the answer to that is the grassroots. But actually, if we've got a situation where we can have a party that can win power in Westminster and is either ambivalent at worst or supportive at best towards independence, I think that's how we achieve that goal.
Great. So we've got a whole array of Green Party positions on the Your Party debate. But, great. No, I think we're at a really interesting place where there's a dissolution of the structures of parties that we know them, and I think that seems clear in any case that there's new things happening. I can see a hand at the back. Please, can we keep our contributions at this stage fairly brief? For another few minutes. Yep.
Yep. Can I speak from here, or do you want me to?
You're fine there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree on the position of independence, but I'm not particularly worried about a particular space that I work on. That is, well, you know, migrant voices in Scotland. It's something very remarkable to see how, in general, migrant people that I know, I work with, friends of mine, everybody is very supportive of Scotland's independence. It's one of the most amazing things that I could, you know, check this for the past 8 years. But I don't feel, and I didn't feel in other spaces, that these migrant voices can actually sometimes be heard, you know? And sometimes I think that the decisions are made for them, on behalf of them, but not there's nobody enabled, you know, that much of a space for these things to actually flourish in a different way. So that's something that I think that for me will be key about this new party. And also, I don't know that much about the Scottish politics, but in my previous experience, when a new party comes to town, you know, you have a lot of old organizations that rapidly go to the center of the stage, and then they start a discussion there, you know. But then other people that are not that close to any of these organizations start to feel like, maybe this is not my conversation, maybe this is not exactly where I should be, you know what I mean? So for me, the new party will be very important that these organizations that, however, they can be key to actually create a functional structure, are smart enough to open this in a way that these other people that are out there just waiting desperately for having this option can actually participate and become activists and not only followers. Isn't it?
Yeah, great. And I won't try and paraphrase it all, but I think it does bring it back to that question around how we ensure that manoeuvres and developments at this stage aren't about demonstrating what already exists in a previous movement and giving that a new life or a new oxygen, but making sure that it's an environment in which the left is a developing culture and is a developing process, is involving those who are part of it in many different ways. And I think that's got to be vital. And thinking about the media and the environment and the events and all the activities that can foster that, I think is really exciting. Is there a final thought or contribution at this stage? Because I do want to speak to yeah. Let's have another.
Yeah, I will just generally make a comment. So and also kind of a question. It feels like you are contorting yourself around many important issues in order to gain popular support. So how do you where is your core values, and also where is your really a cutoff zone, as especially on the general, if your supporter base starts to lean towards homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and racism, how do you draw the line and generally make sure you're promoting acceptance rather than promoting the exclusion?
I mean, I think that's a really important principle to be thinking about, and we don't have time, I guess, to go through every organisation's response to that, but it seems to be a clear imperative. Great, and I think that the one final kind of thing I would say before I introduce a couple of other speakers on themes perhaps of a different kind, is that the opportunity to work through and discuss and debate these tensions and these contradictions and these positions, and that question is how to make this program or position one that's shaped by everyone. It does depend on activity and involvement and media and support and different ways of getting involved. And each of us, you've heard, has a different organisation and different organs, and there's plenty going on. So I suppose one of the things the Scottish Left Review can do and does is when people are getting in touch, there's quite often questions about how to orient to the Scottish Left, and I'm not suggesting that for a moment that the Scottish Left Review knows all the answers, but making sure that there's a place to find where you want to be, I think is going to be important as we go forward too. So to that extent, if anybody wants to have a conversation afterwards by email about writing or about joining in or contributing in other ways to the magazine, or indeed to some of the other organs of different organisations, then please do be in touch. But speaking of the magazine, we're going to take a couple of minutes at closing to hear, first of all, a few words from Comrade Henry, who has contributed a really fascinating piece on the movement, the socialist movement in Clydeside around a century ago, before finishing with a poem from Ali. So just briefly, Henry is a teacher at St Andrews University and a specialist in classics and their reception in and by working class people, I think, in a nutshell, among many other things. So yeah, over to you just for a few words.
Okay, great. Thank you, Callan. And yeah, thank you. I appreciate this is like, yeah, I appreciate Callan opening up the Scottish Life Review to you know, an article like mine, which was you know, about three Socialist Labour Party activists who are writing about Greco-Roman antiquity and drawing on this old you know, historical tradition and you know, sharing with their community in Glasgow stories of ancient rebellion and seeing how that might energize and educate young workers at that time and in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. So sort of from 1917 to about 22, when those parties kind of well, became merged into the Communist Party of Great Britain. So what I yeah, and although that seems, I'm sure, a whole lot less urgent than what we've been discussing right now, I'm glad that I'm able to, you know, contribute, because of course the struggle does also take place on the cultural plane, and it's a shame to exclude it. So that's why I'm happy to be talking. So the piece is about these three men: Tom Anderson, John Clark, and what's the other guy's name? I'm trying to remember. Can you remember? I can't remember. John Clark, don't worry. He's good. He's called Bill Paul. Anyway, and I'll keep it very quick because I spent a bit of time thinking about, well, why, how can I justify you know, taking up a couple of minutes of your time to talk about this subject? And I guess it's come up a bit that there's this threat from the far right at the moment, and it happens to be, you know, when people talk about the classics and Greco-Roman antiquity in particular, people will often think about, you know, people like Boris Johnson and about, you know, red pill far right activists, and there is this, historically we've got connections to fascism in Germany and Italy, and, you know, certainly here and in the United States at the moment. So to show that, you know, that isn't always the case, and it doesn't always have to be the case, to share with people some inspiring stories about how people have appropriated this kind of cultural zone for leftist principles seems like a decent thing to do. So thank you very much, Carl.
Thanks, and thanks, Henry. And I think, like you say, and I think, like all of us know, the literatures and the histories and the reading and the theory and all the discussions that are all part of that left culture are all going to be part of what we're doing as we go forward. So please, as far as your own imagination goes and your own reading goes, if ever you're curious and you want to be thinking about writing something or digging into something a bit, again, the magazine, and not to say a bunch of groups, will be very, very happy to be involved with you in that journey. And I think that's fundamental to who we are on the left as well. I think it's probably uncontroversial to say. So sadly, I mean, it feels like there's a lot that could go on in terms of conversation, but we're out of time in terms of the debate, and I think it would be remiss not to, especially given everything that's happening, take a moment to think about what's happening in Palestine and the activity of the Zionist entity there, and the ways in which the people have persevered, and the ways in which the solidarity with the people of Palestine has, I think, through all this unspeakable horror, been something that we can sort of keep in our hearts, and that's what certainly the hope within all this has been something we've tried to keep alive through everything we've published, including a very well. I'll let the poem speak for itself. But Ali is a poet and a multiple times contributor to the magazine, and her latest collection, Pale Hairs Reach Between Us, is one for you to look up. But I'll hand over for a closing poem from Ali.
Thanks, Colin. Can I borrow your copy of the magazine to read off?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Did not come prepared. Thanks. So I'll just say a tiny bit about the poem before I read it. First of all, it's not at all about party politics. It's about direct action, so I hope that's a relief to some of you. It is, so it's in a really strict form that involves a lot of repetition. I won't explain like the math of it, but like within each stanza, the first or the last words on the end of the lines kind of get repeated a lot. And it's written from a Jewish perspective. It's called Sestina Against Silence. Say free Palestine. Say it at work, in school, on the street. Act like there's no more time, like we're way past first they came for, like there's a genocide. Say genocide. Say it's happening to Palestinians. Do not use metaphor to describe its perpetration. Do not waste time. Consider what action to take, then take that action. This is no fantasy genocide. What you do this time for Palestine is what you'd have done in history for those the Nazis targeted for their detractions from German purification, for whom genocide was given breath, and Palestine stolen to give Britain time to forget the times it maintained quotas for Jewish migrants. Palestine as a salve for how their actions paved roads to genocide. Then and now we say, in voices thick with grief and desperation, it's time to end the genocide that's been happening for generations, acting in our name to destroy Palestine. Israel is committing genocide in Palestine. We say it's time for action.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone. The conversation could go on and will go on. It'll probably go on in a pub nearby as well. So if you want to do that, then hang about and we can head somewhere. But for now, thanks so much to everyone for coming along. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Lighthouse for being fabulous hosts and for broadcasting this to the masses, or at least to the regular watchers. And the network's continuing to grow, so please be part of it and be part of the Scottish Left Reviews network as we build forward. So thanks very much to everyone.